Hello, I'm Jeremy, and today I'm going to be talking about my most anticipated games of Essen Spiel 2019. For those who may not be familiar, that's a board gaming convention that's held in Germany every year, and it generally marks the release of many of the biggest titles of the year in terms of the Euro or family strategy board games, which tend to be my preferred games in the hobby. So each year, even though I've actually never attended the fair, I use it as an opportunity to come up with a list of games I'm going to be importing so I can play them. A lot of them won't get released in the US. And then I do attend BGG-Con, which is a board game geek convention that's held in Dallas, and that is held in November. They get a lot of those games from that fair in for that convention, which is held about 3 weeks after the Essen convention. So I'll play a lot of the games that released at that fair in a few weeks after the fair comes out, whether it's through importing them for personal copies for myself or playing them at that convention. So I tend to do research into the games that are going to be releasing, and since I spend a little bit of time going over the rules, looking at what games might be of interest, I figured putting the information out there about what games interest me might be of interest to people who are going to be attending that fair. Again, I'll mention that I'm releasing this video last week of September. It will still be about 3 or so weeks until Essen Spiel, so the amount of information on some of the games is low. So what I've done when coming up with this list is really focused on the games that I do have more information about. So over the next few weeks, it's very possible that information about games will come out, and those would theoretically have been on this list had I waited, but I figured for people attending the fair, they would want information sooner rather than later so they could better make their plans. So hopefully this will be of interest to people. We'll see. But I will just actually start by talking about a few games that aren't at the fair, or that I guess aren't debuting at the fair, games that I've played over the last few months since I've last made a video. I tend to, on this channel, only make videos if there aren't already videos of games out, or I feel like a game has not gotten the due that it deserves. So there are a few games I've played over the last few months where I haven't been making videos that have kind of fallen through the cracks. I figure I should just briefly mention those before I go into my list. The first one that I will mention is called Barrage, and this is put out by Cranio Creations, and it's thematically a game about generating hydroelectric power by flowing water through dams. And it is a relatively heavy game, especially if you include the expansion, which came out at the same time as the base game. But it's one that I find to be very interesting. It justifies its playtime. It's highly interactive. And although it has a lot of rules overhead, it flows pretty well, no pun intended, once you actually get those rules down. And it's a crunchy game, definitely on the heavier side compared to games I generally enjoy, but it's one that I've really enjoyed my plays of, and it's one that I think has quite a few plays left in it. That is Barrage. Second game is also a relatively heavy game. It's by the name of Black Angel, and this is the follow-up to the game Trois from a few years ago, although now it has a science fiction theme, so it's not thematically linked at all. In it, players are going to be playing, I think, AI on a spaceship, and they're going to be running the various functions of that spaceship as it transports humanity to a new planet that will colonize. And it has a lot of the same mechanisms of that earlier game, Trois, which I do enjoy, but it plays in a shorter period of time, and because of the nature of it, it forces more tactical decision-making than Trois, which that game has cards in it like this game does, but those cards tended to stick around for the whole game, whereas in this game, you have a card and it only stays on the board for a few turns at most. As players cycle that spaceship along, they fall off the board, which sometimes you want to happen, sometimes that will kill the engine that you've been building. It's a very interesting game, one that, again, I think I'll be playing a lot, between now and the end of the year. Third game that I would mention would be Caravan. This is a much simpler game. It's designed by Joel Huber, put out by Rio Grande Games, and it involves picking up and delivering cubes in a desert on a grid board of certain colors and bringing them to a space of the same color on the board. The catch is that you only have a few camel meeples to accomplish this. So generally, if you want to get a cube 10 spaces down the road, you'll have to transport it from the camel on the end to the camel in the front, then start moving the camels from the end to the front, and essentially doing a bucket brigade across the board. Of course, other players are trying to do this at the same time, so you're getting in each other's ways, making each other's actions more expensive, maybe stealing the cube from one another. It's a really nice, tight game design, one that harkens back to the Euro games from around 2000 or so, and I think it stands admirably with those games. So it really scratches an itch that doesn't get scratched that much these days. Really one of the highlights of the year so far for me. That is Caravan. Fourth game I'll mention is Copenhagen. This is probably one that you've heard of. It is essentially a card drafting and Tetris piece manipulation building game. It's a race game where players are just going to be racing to, I think, 12 points, or playing until the deck runs out, a second time or a first time depending on player count. And it's one where you're always going to be worried that the other players are going to pull ahead of you in points, or essentially take the cards that you need in order to get your next move in. Very tight game, very simple, very light, but at the same time always feels very tense. Players are just always going to be competing to get what they want done in what is essentially a 20-minute game. So even though there are a lot of these Tetris-style games to come out over the last few years, this is probably the best of those games. So it's one that I really enjoy. And the last one that I'll mention, I'll spare you my pronunciation of the German name, but it's, I believe, translates as The Island in the Fog. This one I may do a video for. I just got it. I don't think there's an English language video for it yet, and I did a rules translation for it, so I just have to proofread that, do a few more plays of it. But this is a tile-laying game where players are going to be manipulating little hot air balloons around a board, exploring an island, and the objective is essentially to create chains of certain landscape types. So it has almost the feel of a roll and write game, but it's tile laying. So you're actually using physical components, which I prefer generally to just straight up roll and write games. And it's one that I feel it's all about, you essentially roll dice, and that's going to dictate your fate most turns, but it's all about using your limited resources to manipulate those dice to maximize your circumstances. So it's an enjoyable game, and I'll try to do a video of that in the next few days, let you see how that one plays. So that all out of the way, again, none of that really has to do with Essen, although I guess The Island in the Fog, that may be considered an Essen game. I don't know. I have it. It's coming out. It's a relatively new release. That out of the way, I will talk a little bit first about the new expansions that I'm excited about. Then I'm going to talk about the base games that I'm excited about. And I have about 5 expansions and about 10 of the base games. So the first expansion, first I guess I'll mention kind of honorable mentions. So some expansions that are coming. There are ones for Newton, which is an enjoyable Euro game from a few years ago. There are new pads for Ganz Schön Clever and Twice as Clever. Those are essentially dice rolling games that have been pretty popular over the last few years. They've come out with new scoring pads for each of those 2 games, which essentially change up the position of the bonuses on your scoring sheets, which just make them essentially brand new games. So excited to try those. Similarly, there are new pads for Dizzle, which is another roll and write game where players are building out chains of dice on their player sheets. There are 4 new boards coming out for that in a sheet or a score pad. So essentially doubling the number of games that were included in the base game. That's exciting. And the last one that I'll mention is the Rajas of the Ganges expansion. This one would probably have made my top list, except that it seems like it's assembling a lot of smaller promos, 2 of which I already have, which I do think are very necessary to extend the life of that game. But I'm not sure how much new content there is in this particular expansion for me, who has already played half of it. So those are the honorable mentions, if you will, on the expansion front. So moving on. So at number 5, I have the game, or the expansion Terra Mystica, Merchants of the Sea. I think the German version is called Die Handler. And this is an expansion to a game that, to a certain degree, has fallen by the wayside. Terra Mystica is a terrific game and was certainly hugely popular, but then the game Gaia Project, which uses a lot of the same concepts, just transposes it to space and refines a lot of the rules and the balance of that initial game, came out and sort of sucked the wind out of Terra Mystica. But I just played Terra Mystica again recently, maybe a month or so ago, and it really reminded me how pleasurable that game is in either form. So the new expansion for Terra Mystica, again, it's called Merchants of the Sea. The big change to it is it adds a sideboard to your player board where players are going to be able to create a new building type, which is essentially a shipyard. And using that shipyard, players are going to each round generate a couple of small ship tokens that they could use to sail down the rivers that are pre-printed on that map. And the goal of that is to get those to opponents' buildings. And when they get those ships to move into an opponent's building, they're going to get a bonus, and depending on what type of building that is, they'll get a different bonus. So this is just, it seems like a relatively minor expansion. It's not adding a dozen new races or whatever, as far as I could tell, but it's one that I think is going to boost the interactivity of that game, which is already relatively interactive. It wants you to build next to other people. So it does seem like something that's good because it's going to differentiate that game, which I think is good in its own right, further from Gaia Project, give you a reason to go back to that game, which is, an excellent game. So, yeah, that is number 5, the Merchants of the Sea expansion for Terra Mystica. At number 4, I have the Rituals and Ruins expansion for the game Manara, which is I feel, relatively underrated cooperative dexterity game, an unusual mix there. That's a stacking game where players are just using pillars to build levels of a board. Each turn they're going to turn over a card which tells them a task they need to accomplish. And if they get through all those cards and have a tower that's still standing at the end of the game, they win. So that's the basic premise of Manara. It's a game that I've really enjoyed my plays of, and this new expansion for it essentially adds, it's a modular expansion, adds a lot of different changes. So you could it adds different rules cards that you could play with each turn, or each game rather. So like maybe your red pillars will have a rule associated with them or what have you. And then it also adds different floor shapes that you have to build into your tower as you're stacking your thing up. And then there are also certain rules that require you to put gemstones, which are just little glass beads, also onto your tower. So in a dexterity bouncing game, that could obviously get pretty complicated pretty quickly. So these different components, you can mix and match whichever ones you want into it, or it has what I understand to be 10 different scenarios built into the game. So essentially 10 different challenges for you as a group to go in and play the game. So that's nice. It's just a little bit more direction into what is, to me, a strong cooperative game. So just, 10 scenarios for you to overcome, and then you could just, mix and match different components into it from there. So a game that I really enjoy, and it seems worthy of this expansion. Manara, Rituals, and Ruins. The third expansion that I'll talk about is another one of my favorite games from last year, certainly a heavier game. It is the New Discoveries expansion for Underwater Cities. And like the Manara expansion, this is a modular expansion. It has, I guess, new cards, new assistants, new starting tiles, and new bonuses for connecting cities. And you can play with any mix of those things that are in there. So if you've played the game a lot, that will mix it up. One of the disappointments about Underwater Cities is if you're playing on the advanced side, which of the player boards, which I think is how you generally will play, there's only 4 of those included in the base box. So really, those to a certain degree will dictate your strategy. So they've added another 4 of those into the game. And now there's going to be more variability in those. It also has a new monster mechanic, which I don't know anything about yet. They've been posting updates about this on their Facebook page, so I'm not sure about the monster mechanic, so I'm not sure if that that seems to be something new as opposed to more cards of an existing type. But having the ability to change out your starting resources, your player board, those are pretty substantial changes for a game that already had a lot of variability baked into the box. And from what I understand, they are going to actually upgrade the components of those player boards so that they're going to be the 3D ones insofar as they have wells to stick your pieces into, so if somebody bumps the table, everything doesn't get shifted off. So they'll include apparently the 4 basic player boards as well as the 4 new boards in that upgraded form. So that's nice. It's always nice when they go back and fix components that were a little bit weak in the original game. And in Underwater Cities, the base player boards, they were essentially just a piece of paper. So getting those upgraded to a nice cardboard player board is a nice change. So I'm looking forward to that expansion. At number 2, I have Heaven and Ale, Kegs and More, and this is actually one that I probably would have had number 1 based on anticipation, except there's relatively little information about this in terms of how the mechanics work. I do know that it involves, Heaven and Ale is a game about making beer, and it's a very convoluted process where you have to make sure you have X number of every ingredient in order to produce 1 barrel of beer. So it's a relatively convoluted process of making beer, and interestingly, the beer doesn't get produced until the end of the game, but with this expansion, it's about delivering the beer that you make, so I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work, since you, in the base game, make all of your beer only at the end of the game. But it's going to apparently require you to also produce 2 more resources, essentially barrels and hay to feed a donkey and to transport your beer, and that will give you another avenue to get bonus points. Heaven and Ale is a relatively enjoyable game. I actually like it more than most Euro games over the last few years, so I'm excited for anything that's going to change up that game, and I'm looking forward to learning more about it. So Heaven and Ale, Kegs and More. And the last expansion that I have on here, which is, it's a little bit of a misnomer to call it expansion, is the Quest for El Dorado, the Golden Temples. This is a standalone expansion, so it's a new base game that you could also use and combine with the original base game or the first expansion. And this essentially changes up that Quest for El Dorado game. So first of all, it gives you all new cards. So essentially there's going to be 12 new cards that you could add to your existing card market, and there's a mechanism to limit how many of those could be introduced from game to game. But more importantly, it gives you a whole new set of route tiles. This is for those who aren't familiar with it, a race game, a deck building race game where players are going to be trying to move across symbols on a board by playing cards each turn. So it introduces a new symbol type on the board that you have to contend with. And more interestingly, and most interestingly, I would say, whereas the original game had you moving along a linear path, racing other players to get to a temple, in this one there's always going to be a branching path where there's going to be 3 temples that you have to visit each of them, but you could do it in any order, and then you have to race back to, I think, the start point. So because of that, there's going to be more decision making, whereas in the base game you might always have to, maybe the second tile is going to require you to have water cards, so you'll have to build up your water cards before you get that. Here you can choose what order you want to tackle the various obstacles before, so players are going to be more differentiated in their strategies, even though they're all trying to get through all 3 of those temples. Having choice in the order in which they do that is going to make that, I think, a more interesting strategic game. It also has some other small things, like there are cave tiles in the base game. Here there are temple tiles that if you stop next to them, instead of you getting a bonus, other players are going to get a bonus. So, choosing to take a shortcut that might give other players a bonus becomes a strategic thing. But overall, it looks like it's going to be the expansion that I wish that first expansion was for the Quest for El Dorado. This one really mixes up how you play the game, really seems to extend the strategy, and introduces as many cards as there were in the original base game into the mix. So one that I'm really looking forward to, that is the Quest for El Dorado, the Golden Temples. So with that all out of the way, I'll talk about now the full games as opposed to the expansions that I'm most anticipating for the fair. I don't really have a list of honorable mentions, but there are 3 games that I thought I'd mention just because they're more spin-off games than full games in their own right. 2 of them are card game versions of full games. The first one is called Masters of Renaissance, Lorenzo Il Magnifico, the card game. So this is obviously a card game version of Lorenzo Il Magnifico. And I did watch a video of this one online, and it looks like it plays in about 30 to 45 minutes, so about half the time of the base game. And it's a much simpler version of that base game, but it has some interesting mechanisms. First of all, there's like a market that you can manipulate using marbles, where you pick a row or a column of marbles. You get items from that market based on the color of it. Then you slide a marble in there to change what's available for the next player to use it. So that's always cute, that sort of thing. And it's not really just a deck of cards. There's this whole marble action selection thing. And then you have a player board in front of you where you're going to have a limited ability to store resources, which are stored not on cards but on wooden meeples. And essentially 3 card spaces where you're going to be able to buy cards using those resources that will give you conversion options, and those are going to let you convert into other resources or potentially points. So really you're just going to have over the course of the game buy maybe up to 7 cards. I think that's the game end trigger, and hopefully build an engine out of those 7 cards that you're buying. The trick is that there are 3 levels of cards, and on each of those 3 stacks that you have in front of you, you have to put down a level 1 card before you could then cover it up with a level 2 card and eventually a level 3 card. So there is definitely the engine building component of it from the base game, but it does seem like its own beast in a lot of ways. There are not still the worker placement actions. There are not the dice mechanisms from the base game. It's its own little thing. So it's one that looks like, since it runs about half the time of the big game, it's one that looks like something that deserves to exist in its own right. The next one that I'll talk about is Brussels 1897. This is a follow-up to Brussels 1893. Again, it's a card game version of that. This one seems to hew a lot closer to the original design than the Lorenzo Il Magnifico card game does. This one, it uses cards to essentially simulate that auction that the original game had, if you're not familiar with it. Essentially, this is a game that's set in the Art Nouveau period in Belgium, around the turn of the 20th century. And in it, players are going to be using cards, essentially now as workers, to place onto a position. But the unique mechanism, which is retained in this version of the game, is that when you're placing a card down or a worker down, you're also making a bid with money, which serves several functions at first. So first of all, it's declaring an action that you're taking. Second, it's serving as a bid in an auction for a bonus card when you evaluate that row at the end of a round. And third is potentially getting you points for getting area majority around a central point shared between several of those cards. So that's all retained as far as I can tell in this game versus the base game. Seems like the main difference between these two is that when you're doing that, you are going to be changing out what options are going to be available in that board radically from round to round, as opposed to using a board which is more stable, like in the base game. Here, because it's cards that are declaring what actions are available, those are going to be changing out every single round. They're going to, and it seems like some of the other parts of the game have been hewed away. But generally, the main mechanism is here. I enjoy that mechanism. I feel like Brussels 1893 is a really underrated Euro game, kind of in the Feld style. It's a little bit of a point salad, lots of different routes to victory, one that I've enjoyed. So I'm very willing to look at the new version of that. The last one that I'll talk about is, instead of a card game of a board game, it's a board game of a card game. And this is the 6-Nimmt Brett Spiel, or board game. And this is a board game version of the classic version of 6-Nimmt, which is a, at least maybe 25-year-old card game designed by Wolfgang Kramer. And it is essentially plays up to 8 players. Almost feels like a party game where players are going to be secretly selecting cards, revealing them, and then putting them into a rows. If ever you're putting the 6th card in a row, you have to take that row, which is going to get you negative points. So that's the basic principle of this. Here it's transported into a card or to a board game format. There already is a board game version of this, which is only printed in German. And I do have that version of this. It looks like this one's going to add several things to that older version of it. So looks like it's going to, at the very least, add a second board to it, which will change up the way that those rows work. So whereas in the original 6 NIMT, you always took a card on the 6th row in the way that, or the 6th card added to a row. In this one, the number of cards that you're going to need to play to a row vary based on what it shows on the board. So maybe it'll be lower, maybe it'll be longer. So that board game version of it that already exists is probably my preferred way of playing 6 NIMT. So I'm interested in seeing this new implementation of that board game, seeing what it adds to the formula, since that game fits a pretty specific niche where you could really pull it out with anyone, and it accommodates a large number of players. Almost has the feeling of a party game. So using it in a board game where you have a board and instead of cards you have tiles, I'm looking forward to seeing how that one works. Alright, so that all out of the way, I'm finally ready to get to the top 10, or actually I have 11 games on here. So these are my most anticipated full or new release games. So I'll just get going. Okay, so starting at number 11, I have Deep Blue, which is the new release from Days of Wonder. Generally, I'm very interested in what Days of Wonder puts out because they tend to really develop their games, make them about as good as they could be. This one has, you know, nice art and everything, nice components, everything you would expect from Days of Wonder normally. Something that I noticed, I looked at the rules which they've posted online for this, is that it does seem to be a bit of a push your luck game, which tend not to be my favorite. I am a little bit worried about the gameplay of the game because it does sound like you really have only a few simple options on your turn. You can either only pull gems, I guess, from a bag and hope you don't get a blue or a black gem, which will cause you to go bust. Or you could buy a card which will increase the number of ways that you'll score when you pull gems. So it does seem very simple, and I really hesitated putting it on this list because it's at number 11, but I do really trust the developer. And also the design team behind it. They've been responsible for some of the better family games of the last few years. So Copenhagen, which I mentioned previously, as well as Flamme Rouge and Frog Riders. Those are all family games that I think are really terrific. So I assume that between those designers and Days of Wonder producing, this is going to be more than meets the eye. So this is a little bit of a hedging recommendation or anticipation, but hopefully, you know, it's a little bit more than just pulling out of the bag, hoping you get the right color. I guess time will tell. That is number 11, Deep Blue. So at number 10, I have Olubari, A Nice Cup of Tea. This one's designed by Tony Boydell. And this is an update to a game that he designed by the name of Snowdonia. It's essentially a refinement of it, from what I understand, and a slightly more complex version of it. Snowdonia is a game that I've played, you know, several times, and I enjoy to a degree. But I think it was a game that certainly could benefit from another iteration. Some of the things in that game did irk me. So I remember playing that game and feeling sometimes like the randomness of the weather mechanic that exists in that game has you know, really caused me to lose the game. Just, you know, the wrong card got flipped at the wrong time and I had no good action on a given turn. It does seem like some of those elements might still be present in this one. But it's, like I said, it's a spin-off of that game. So Snowdonia was a game about building a railroad either in England or Scotland, I believe. And this one's about building a railroad to Darjeeling so you could transport tea. So it uses a lot of the same mechanics, but the tea itself becomes a way that you could apparently like supercharge your actions, and it becomes another thing that you have to worry about when you're trying to, you know, manage your resources, and trying to deploy when you do your T bonus actions apparently makes the game feel a little bit more consequential in its decision making. Otherwise, you know, it's refining a lot of those ideas that were present in Snowdonia. So because I liked Snowdonia but didn't love it, and because I wanted to believe that there was a good game there, I've put this one, Olubari, A Nice Cup of Tea, onto my list. So Moving on, at number 9, I have a game which is put out by Hook and Friends, and this is named Humboldt's Great Voyage. This looks to be a relatively light family weight game, maybe 30 to 45 minute playtime on it for 2 to 4 players. So very much, your standard issue German family game, which to me is a positive. I generally like those games, and this one is thematically, it's about exploration of the New World, the North America. But in practice, it looks to be a Mancala-driven game where you're going to pick up the pieces on a space and distribute them along adjacent spaces, hoping to set up combinations of different colored discs in order to score cards. So really just, a nice pattern recognition game where you're just going to be collectively manipulating the same board. So almost like a 5 Tribes sort of thing, but it seems like it's several steps lighter than that. But it has nice, clean art. It's from a publisher that I enjoy. And from what I've seen of the game, it looks like something that's really in my sweet spot in terms of complexity. So that is Humboldt's Great Voyage, my number 9. At number 8, I have Orleans Stories. And this one's put out by Reiner Stockhausen, and I believe DLP Games is the publisher of that, the same publisher as the Orleans original game. And this is a game that is a standalone game technically, but it might feel more like a spin-off in practice. Essentially, this introduces different scenarios into the Orleans system. So it looks like a lot of the same mechanisms are there, the bag building mechanism and how you acquire workers and activate actions. That all is generally the same. But what changes here is that each game now you're going to have a board that changes. There'll be different buildings available out on that board that you could activate, whereas the original game had a static map every game. And then also it's going to introduce the stories aspect of it, is that each game you're going to have essentially different requirements to trigger the end of the game so that you could accomplish. If a player accomplishes all of those, the game end will be triggered. But then also different scoring benefits to doing different actions. So essentially different objectives as well as different scoring conditions for each game. I'm not sure how many stories are involved in this. Again, stories, it just seems to be scenarios. In this case, it's not really like a legacy type game. But it does seem like it's designed to essentially change it so you're not going to be able to do the same dominant strategy from game to game, which I feel like in the original Orleans, you could hew towards a certain strategy each game, get the same technology tiles each game, and try to build your engine in the same direction each time. Here, it's going to force players to change it out from game to game, which is something that I feel like Orleans really could benefit from. So that's why I included it on my list. Next one at number 7 is Tajuto, which is designed by Reiner Knizia, and it's put out by Super Meeple. So Knizia is a favorite designer of mine. And this one seems to be relatively simple. It's essentially players the setting is in ancient Japan. You're Buddhist monks in the Shinto era, trying to build temples to show your devotion to Buddha, and it has a unique aspect in it where players are collectively going to be building those temples on their turns. You essentially have action tiles in front of you. You could activate those action tiles to do actions, either to draw temple pieces from the bag, and you could kind of determine from the bag what size the temple piece is, but you can't determine what color the piece is. So you're drawing it blindly from the bag, and you could feel tactilely how big that piece is, but you don't know what color it is. So if you need a base, any of them will do, but once a base is down, you need the next size up. But if the base hasn't been built yet, you're going to be drawing out a piece that you can't build. You have to build them in order from biggest to smallest. So that's interesting, but it makes it sound like a lighter game, I think, than this actually is, because there's also an engine building aspect of it where as you build those pieces out, you'll get points which you could then use to acquire more tiles, so you'll get more actions on your turn, or to acquire point tiles, which is how you're actually going to be scoring during the game. And then as these temples get built up, at once per game, you could essentially take one of your cubes of the color of that temple, put it on there, and you score points for the size of the temple. Any player could do that, even though you're collectively building the temples. And then essentially, once that temple is scored, it can't be scored again until somebody else adds to build more of that temple. So it does seem that there's a lot of brinkmanship in when you're going to score the temple, or if you're going to build on a temple that you've already scored. And essentially getting those points is really just a means to an end to get your actual points. So those points are really just money that you use to buy points, or you choose to, instead of buying points, buy more actions per turn. So it's like a lot of Knizia games. It seems like it's really distilled down to a really simple premise, but it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. So I'm really looking forward to that one. It seems like it has a really nice art, really great physical production, like Super Meeple usually does, but really straightforward gameplay, balancing both the engine building and the scoring needs against each other. So one I'm looking forward to, that is Tajuto by Reiner Knizia. At number 6, I have Cooper Island. This is going to be put out by Capstone Games, and the designer's name is Ode. That's his, I believe, his nickname or his design name, and this game is largely on here because of his past games. He's designed La Granja and Solarius Mission. Those are two, I would say, almost knockoff Stefan Feld games, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. They just are very much in the spirit of Stefan Feld games, in that they have a lot of different mechanisms meshed together in a way that's satisfying. This seems to be very much in that same field. Pardon me. And this is kind of from looking at the rulebook, it looks like, to a certain extent, just a standard Euro game, worker placement game, where you're going to be moving along tracks, building up. You have a personal island where you can put different tiles on there, and that will generate or determine how many resources you generate when you take a harvest action, as well as a lot of various contracts to fill. So a lot of generally normalized standard Euro mechanisms that are mushed together, but based on the strength of the designer's past designs, I'm interested in it. And also just looking at the rulebook, it's very cleanly laid out, even though it's complex. And it does seem like there's going to be a lot of different paths to victory in it. One of the interesting things in this game is that it looks like you have two scoring markers, two little boat scoring markers. One that goes clockwise around the scoring track, one that goes counterclockwise. And whenever you score these boat points, you're going to choose which of those boats you want to pilot. One could go the one way, one could go the other way. And as they transport around the board, they'll hit various bonuses. You'll fire off different bonuses depending on which of those two boats that you move. So that seems a little unique in it. But generally, this just looks like a really well-produced game. I will say that Capstone Games, which is putting this out, they've kind of been on a roll lately. A lot of their games that they've put out in the last year or so have been really terrific, so shout out to them. And this is the one that they're putting out at this Essen that I am most excited about. That is Cooper Island. At 5, we have a very similarly themed game, Maracaibo. This is designed by Alexander Pfister, who's another designer that I think has been really stellar, having a stellar run the last few years. So this is similarly themed like Cooper Island. It's about sailing in the Caribbean. And this seems like, to compare it to other Alexander Pfister games, again, I've looked at the rule book for this, it looks like it's kind of a combination of a lot of mechanisms from Great Western Trail and Mombasa kind of smushed together. I've heard tell that this is one of his most complex games, and the rulebook doesn't seem that daunting, I have to say. It's relatively long, but it doesn't seem that daunting. But I do notice that the playtime that they're listing is 40 minutes per player, so that would suggest a 3-hour game with 4 players. So maybe it is more than it lets on, but it does have element of a stock market in it, and it has some interesting card play where you can kind of carry cards over from round to round, which reminds me a little bit of Mombasa. But ultimately, it just seems like like a lot of the recent Pfister games. So elements you could see from Blackout Hong Kong, all of which are games I've enjoyed. So this one makes it easily onto the list just based on past performance, I think. But a lot of the things are that there's completing personal goals or choosing to upgrade your ship or you have to move your ship around on the board before you take each action. So a lot of these things are similar, like I said, to Great Western Trail. So it'll just be interesting to see a different sandbox from this designer. One thing that has me, I guess, placing this, it's still at number 6 on my list, but it's placing it slightly lower on the list, is that it seems to a certain extent to be a campaign game or a legacy game, and those are not my favorite types of games. I tend to bounce off of those legacy components of games, but it seems like that's entirely optional in this case. So, I'm still more than willing to give this one a chance. That is Maracaibo, designed by Alexander Pfister. At number 4, I have a game much different than the last two. That is Trails of Tucana, which is a roll and write game, and this one's designed by Christian Otsby, who's the designer of Avenue, which is a really terrific roll and write game, as well as Escape and Santa Maria, which were interesting designs as well. So he's kind of like a designer who's on my radar. And this is a pretty simple roll and write game, of maybe 15 to 20 minute game for 1 to 8 players, where players are going to each turn up 2 cards. They have an island map. Each player has their own little island map, which is divided into hexes in front of them. The 2 cards will show 2 territories, like essentially like a mountain and a river or something, and you have to connect a mountain and a river that are adjacent on your board next to each other. And as this is happening, you're essentially going to be creating paths on your map in front of you, with the goal to be to connect various cities to one another. So there will be like a city A up here on the map and a city A down here on the map. If ever you get those to connect, you'll score bonus points. There's also smaller, shorter things that you want to connect to as you're branching out your network. So this is just, to me, it reminds me of another flip and write game that I like by the name of Tracks, but this one seems to be a little bit more thematic, with you connecting on little landmarks on an island. It also has a second side of the board that you could use, which is a more complex side, where you play, instead of twice through the deck, you play 3 times through the deck, so maybe a slightly longer version of the same game. But for a game that looks to be well presented, simple rules, plays up to 8 players in about 20 minutes, that's definitely something that's hitting a sweet spot for me. So I'm very interested in getting a copy of Trails of Tucana, my number 4. At number 3, I have a game designed by Freedom and Freeze by the name of Fast Slots, and this is it's kind of a pick up and deliver game, but in the guise of a no randomness race game. Essentially, players are going to be playing sloths, who are going to be tokens that are placed out onto the board. But sloths are lazy, the theme says, so they never are going to be moving directly because of the player. So you're never going to actually move your token, except if another animal pushes that token around. So players are going to be playing cards to manipulate other animal tokens, which are going to be jointly controlled by all players, hopefully using those to push into their tokens and move their little tokens around. So I say that this is also a race game because you're going to have leaves in your various color put out around on the board, and you want to push your token all the way over to collect all of those leaves. And so the player that collects those leaves the quickest is going to be the winner of the game. So it has a race element to it. And this game just looks very charming. It looks like it has some really cool variability based into it, not just in terms of the board, but in terms of what animals you're putting out on the board, because each of those has a different deck of cards associated with it and can move differently. So that's exciting, and it really seems to harken back to a game that I like, an old game by the name of Mississippi Queen, which is a similar low randomness race game where players are really pushing each other across the map on a hex board. And so when I looked at it and I saw what the game was, it really made me think fondly of that game. And that's actually, I think, getting reprinted right now. And that, I think, will be a new Essen release, the reprint of Mississippi Queen, which I do have. I could vouch for the quality of that reprint. It includes the Black Rose expansion from the original game in the new box. It's well produced. So that would also be worth looking at, the Mississippi Queen reprint. But Fast Loss seems like a nice spiritual successor to that game. Really looking forward to that. It also has an expansion coming out at Essen as well. I didn't look into what the expansion added, but I just read the base game rules, and it seems like something that is going to be really enjoyable. That is my number 3, Fast Loss. So at number 2, I have a game by the name of Miyabi. This is going to be put out designed by Michael Kiesling, and this is it seems to me like a spin-off of another Michael Kiesling game by the name of Sansushi, which is one that I've enjoyed. That's a relatively light family-style game, and this is definitely that as well. And it's put out by Haba, who has been getting into slightly more complex games. They used to be a children's game publisher. Now they're doing family games as well. And in this one, players are going to be taking turns drafting tiles from a pool and adding them to their player board. You have essentially a player board, which is just a personal grid in front of you, and it's divided into rows. Each row could only hold symbols that are on those tiles. So, like, for example, if you draft a tile that has maybe like a lily pad on it, it could only go in your second row, the lily pad part of that tile. So you might take a 3-block tile. One of those blocks will have a lily pad on it. So that part of the tile has to go in your lily pad row. Otherwise, you could rotate it however you want. And you could also, interestingly, stack those tiles on top of one another as you're building out. So the way the game scores is you want to both create high versions of those stacks. So once you hit level 5 with a given stack, you'll get a bonus tile. But at the end of the game, you want to have as many of those symbols showing on your board. So if you're stacking on top of other symbols, you're covering them up. So at the end of the game, whoever has the most symbols of each type showing is going to get points as well. So you're really going to be worrying about stacking those tiles for height to score points, but also leaving as many of those symbols showing to score points. So it's just, relatively simple game. It looks like one that is a family weight game, definitely, but that's the kind of thing that I tend to enjoy. So, and Michael Kiesling is, absolutely stellar designer. So I have a lot of faith in him to put out a quality, well-tested game. So that is Miyabi, my number 2. And then finally, my number 1 is called Terramara. And this one's designed by a group of Italian designers who have put out a lot of the recent best Euro games of the last few years. So games like Coimbra, Grand Austria Hotel, Lorenzo Il Magnifico, Egizia. These are all designers that are games that have been designed by at least some of the designers that are involved in this game. And this is a worker placement engine building game. On paper, it seems pretty mundane. The big hook of it, I suppose, is that it has a board that's divided up into various sections. Certain boards, each round, are going to flip over. If the board flips over, it'll change what is available on it, but it'll also recall your workers. So when you're placing your workers in this game to get your various activated actions, you can either place on one where you're going to get the worker back because that tile is going to flip over, or you could choose to put it on a tile that's not going to flip over yet, hoping that getting a better action is worth not getting the worker back for the next round. Beyond that, you're generally just going to be collecting resources, collecting cards that are going to give you essentially an engine building component to make your, I think this is set in Italy or something, to make your group, your tribe of people better than the other tribes and more distinct from the other tribes. But it looks like, to a large degree, the appeal of this game is going to be, A, that unique worker placement mechanism, and then B, just the variability of the setup. Just because those tiles are going to be different each game, as well as the cards that you're going to be collecting to give you unique powers. It seems like there's a huge number of ways that you could go in this game, and it's just one that, based on past performance of the designers, I have to, of course, be excited for it. So that is my number 1, Terramara. So I think I'll wrap it up there. Hopefully, that has given you some guidance in what you should be paying attention to this fair. Again, I haven't played the vast majority of those games, so I don't have any insider information beyond what's been publicly available, whether that's rule books or videos that other people have posted online. But right now, that is what I am most anticipating this Essen Spiel 2019. So with that, I'll say thanks for watching and take care.